and all of that, and the sort of fairy feel to it. I don't know if that's why I'm personally drawn to that story, but it just seemed like, I mean, I guess it almost took place in a kind of magical England of the past, and that's the way that I think of the fairy world, is it's something, it's like a magical second dimension almost right next to our own. I've got another question here from Julian Snape. He's wondering if tales of modern day UFO abductions have their roots in fairy abductions.
I think there has to be a relationship between these. Um, I mean, let's just set out the information here. I mean, first of all, we haven't really talked about this, so it's worth underlining it.
Mhm.
There is a strong idea in fairy lore that fairies steal human beings and that they replace them with fake human beings. So in some ways, fairies are interfering with human beings, and this is particularly true of children. There's the idea that fairies come, um, especially at night, and they can steal children.
The
And so
the changeling story is
the
interesting.
whole changeling story, and of course, when you think of modern alien stories, that it's very similar. The idea, particularly the whole part of ufology, which says that aliens come into our house, they come into our bedrooms. This is something that you get again and again in fairy descriptions, and
Right.
then some they interfere with us. And there's also another strand of fairy legends where fairies actually have sexual relations with human beings while
Mhm.
human beings are in bed, and that is also something that you get in what we could call alien lore. So I think that this is absolutely true. And to be fair, people have been writing about this in different ways for the last say 30 or 40 years.
Mhm. Yeah,
um
and there's that whole concept of, like, the nightmare, and people having sleep paralysis, and then they'll have these experiences, and some of them they'll describe more as fairies, and others in modern times it'll be aliens. And I don't know if that just sort of changed with our awareness of space, and going to the moon and everything.
I mean, I would. The thing I always think of, I don't know much about UFOs, and in the same way, I find fairies extremely attractive. I just never really. I guess I don't like UFOs. I think that's the bottom line, without wishing to offend people who do. But I think that if you're looking, uh,
I'm the same
I
way, actually. I much prefer fairy stories and fairy encounter stories to alien encounter stories.
yeah, so we're absolutely on the same page with this.
Yeah.
But I think that when you look at I think something happens. I think the most significant thing that happens as far as the change between fairies and aliens is human beings learn to fly. And I think from that moment, 100 odd years ago, what happens is we start to look upwards. We start to look upwards, and we're seeing more and more supernatural forces. And I'd interpret UFOs as basically being the modern supernatural in the sky, and there's just a growth for more and more interest in these forces. And so
Mhm.
as far as I'm concerned, my suspicion is that they're one and the same thing.
Yeah, I think that there's probably some truth to that, and it's just that, we're seeing it through a different lens, we're interpreting
Yes,
it
yeah, different
differently.
lens. Yeah.
I this is sort of changing a little the track a little bit, but it's something that I've been interested in. What can you tell me about the concept of elf shot? Where someone will get like they'll feel like they were hit by something, and
Yeah. Well, there is this idea that fairies, that one of the ways that they can punish human beings who contravene their laws is to shoot them. Um, and we have lots of references to this, from Britain, from Scotland, from Ireland. But it's also interesting. It's one of the parts of fairy lore which crossed from Britain, Ireland, and mainland Europe to the Americas. And so there were also references from the Ozarks, from Nova Scotia, from Newfoundland, to
Mhm.
the idea that fairies can shoot people. And very often, the origins of these legends seem to have been small flint arrowheads that date back to Neolithic or even Paleolithic times that were prepared by earlier generations of humans. And these arrowheads are tiny, and they were often interpreted as being shot by the fairies. So, for example, if you were in your field and you stumbled on one of these, as statistically every so often you would, and
Then
if
then
that's right.
you might assume that this had been shot by the invisible hands, waiting behind
That, that
a
that's
tree.
That's it. And it's not just a human thing. The reason I said a field is because it's the kind of thing, if your cows started dying and you found one of these, you'd think, oh my God, the fairies have it in for us. And
Yeah.
at this point we've got to find some kind of solution. And there's this business which is a little bit gross, at least for me. But when human beings were fairies shot, they often used to develop it's very peculiar, but swellings on their legs, typically on their legs, but also on their arms. And when these swellings were opened up, things would fall out of them: feathers, twigs, bits of grass, hay, things like this. And this was often interpreted as being a fairy attack.
Wow, that's fascinating. I had never heard that they'd
I
actually
mean,
have objects.
absolutely within. And the best place for this in fairy lore is actually the place where we have the best modern records for is Nova Scotia.
Oh, really? I
Nova
mean,
Scotia and also Newfoundland. So Atlantic Canada. You've got to think that Nova Scotia and Newfoundland is more so than Ireland, is the place in the Western world where fairy lore has survived the longest. I mean, there are beliefs that you will find in Newfoundland that maybe today aren't taken as seriously as they were 20 years ago. Which, it's just, for someone from Britain and Ireland, it's just extraordinary that people had these beliefs that had often died out a couple of hundred years before in Britain. I mean, for example, there is an idea that if you want to protect yourself from fairies and you live in Newfoundland, people will give you a tiny piece of bread to put in your pocket. And this is an idea that's still present today in Newfoundland, but that was acted on very seriously up until the 80s and the 90s in some communities. And yet, you find that idea in Devon, in Britain, in the 1700s. I mean, but it was an idea that was clearly dying out in Britain then, but that survived on the other side of the Atlantic.
yeah, that's actually really incredible. I mean, I know that there's a large Irish, immigrant population in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So, they may have brought their beliefs over, and for some reason, I think after people emigrate after, some kind of tragedy or what, like with the potato famine, maybe you cling more to your roots, so that could explain. That's just a theory I just came up with right now, but
Oh, well done. No, no, no. No. I think it's a very credible theory. I mean, one thing that's always been interesting about fairy lore, particularly thinking now of America and Canada, is that most people who specialize in the subject will tell you that fairies don't cross the Atlantic. And yet, I've just finished doing an article with a wonderful American folklorist and writer named Chris Woodyard, where we've looked at all the different examples of fairy lore surviving in parts of the United States, and particularly in Atlantic Canada.
yeah, and even, like, Native Americans and Native Canadians, many of them will have,